All right, let's talk about Ronald Coase's other big paper he wrote first, where he introduced the notion of transaction costs, which is the nature of the firm. And so the big question he was looking at is if markets are so great, why do we see firms? So when we say firm, we normally think of a business, but really it's just some organization. Organization? Sorry, it's tough to spell and speak at the same time. So why do we see, instead of sort of this diffuse decentralized network, why do we see instead that really what's going on is we have these sort of hierarchical networks, these things with org charts with a bunch of employees working under some manager. Basically, what we see is within a firm, we are not exploiting the power of supply and demand. And we need supply and demand to make rational use of scarce resources in a complex economy. We cannot exist the way that we are used to existing without markets. So Coase looks at this and he says, well, if markets are so great, but we've got these firms, and these firms are directing things not on the basis of competitive prices, but by dictate, by the boss. The boss tells you what's going to go where, what's going on here. And the short version is transaction costs. This is sort of the answer to a lot of economic puzzles. Why is some weird thing happening that doesn't look like our usual supply and demand question? It's probably transaction costs. So even with externalities, why do we have this externality? Well, if we have this externality, it's probably because there's some high transaction costs, some non-zero transaction costs, or unclear property rights, which we might think of as another transaction cost. Right? So if we don't have this ability to bargain to an efficient outcome, that's when we're going to be left with this marginal social cost that diverges from the private cost. Likewise, the cost of using the market is not zero. So if you're trying to buy something, right, you've got to figure out who is a good source. Who can you trust? We'll talk a little bit more about this in the next module when we talk about exchange in black markets. That's a case where everything is sort of stacked against you. But if we've got these low transaction costs and we know who to go to, well, we just outsource. We go to the market. If you are, say, trying to run a business, rather than have an employee, if transaction costs are low enough, then you can just sort of go onto Fiverr and you can find a freelance worker to do it. So when we have high transaction costs, what that means is we can't easily go to the market. And as a result, we sort of set up what we might call, I believe, was this Coase who said this? I think he might have used this phrase. It might have been someone else. Islands of socialism in a sea of markets. Now, I'm using socialism in the economist sense here. This doesn't mean sharing. It doesn't mean egalitarianism. It doesn't mean from each according to their ability. It means centralized control. It means authority figures deciding how to use resources. So why do we have these islands of socialism in a sea of markets? It's because if you're running a business, you need certain things done, and having those things organized by prearranged contracts, right? So Farmingdale State College, they know that they could get an adjunct to teach any given class. They could auction off these classes and see who's willing to do them for the lowest price. But in order to have a stable ability to provide the goods that Farmingdale is selling, it's a lot easier to have these prearranged contracts. It's easier to sort of have some rigidity and lose the benefits of the information we get from markets on a small scale. Right? Now, we still have this larger scale thing where we do go to markets. Now, let me do a really quick digression on a related thing. This is one of my favorite concepts. And this is, again, in the way that we're seeing sort of a boundary between where we have the supply and demand econ thing with markets, and then this, call it, arrangement by fiat. Someone says what to do. There's boundaries, right? And these boundaries have to do with the underlying reality, the underlying logic of the situation. Dunbar's number. This is one of my favorite little bits of sociology. Dunbar's number is, well, it's not a specific number, but it's about 150. We, as a species, evolved to hunt gazelle, right? We evolved, 200,000 years ago when Homo sapiens first branched off from wherever. We come from a long line of primates who roamed around in villages with about 150 people. And this 150 is sort of a baked-in cognitive limit. So what can our brains handle? There's a great example that's coming to mind right now where this was from Daniel Kahneman's research on behavioral economics. You write some number, right? So let's say 191013. If I ask you to take this number and subtract 1 from each of the digits, you get 0.80902, right? So that's like a little thing where I'm asking you to kind of juggle some numbers in your head. So if I ask you to remember this number by subtracting 1 off each digit, that's something that we can handle. But if we start adding too many things to this, it becomes too much for our brain to juggle, right? We get confused, we get lost, we forget. There are limits to what we can know, right? There are limits to what our brain can handle. In the same way, there are limits to what your computer can handle, right? If you are running a Windows 95 computer and you're trying to play Halo on it, it's not going to work. If you are using a Paleolithic brain and you try to do the same exercise with 12 digits, or you try to make the rules more complicated, eventually there's just so much we can handle. And in terms of social relationships, that number is about 150. So our brains, on average, some people are going to be better, some are worse, but our brains can basically deal with 150 people being actually people. Beyond that, we're dealing with strangers, right? So there's a story, a thought experiment I like to run through in class to make this point. So let's say you've got a first date. Let's assume that we're in the before times when such a thing still existed. So you've got this date. You're going to go meet some new person for this date, and you take a cab to her house. And on the way, you think, oh, maybe I should get her flowers. So you go to the florist, and at the florist, you can see you can get a bouquet for $20. And then you think about what you learned in your economics classes, and you think, well, $20 for, some bouquet of flowers, maybe you get her, roses, and that's nice, but, maybe she doesn't like roses. Maybe she likes some other flower. Maybe you get her, sunflowers, right? But maybe she hates sunflowers. You don't know this person's favorite type of flower. You don't really know what to get her. Maybe she doesn't like flowers at all. Maybe she get her candy. But then you think, okay, well, all these bouquets are $20. I'm going to give her $20, and she can get whichever flower she likes. So you go, you knock on her door, and you hold out a crisp $20 bill, and you say, hey, I'm Rick. Let's go out. What's going to happen? She's going to slam the door in your face when you offer her a cash gift. That's a terrible idea. Do not give your first date $20 cash on that first date, although it is true that $20 is better than a $20 bouquet of flowers, because that $20 could buy that bouquet of flowers, so it's at least as valuable, but it could also buy a different bouquet or candy or something else. So the $20 is objectively better, except that we are inside Dunbar's number. If you're going on a first date, you are saying, I want you to be part of my 150 people. I want you to be part of my tribe, or I want to explore the possibility of that. And the rules for how we behave inside Dunbar's number are very different than the rules for how we behave with strangers. If you're talking to the cashier at your grocery store, you're dealing with a stranger. If you're talking to someone in your friend group or your family or someone you're trying to invite into that inner circle, different rules apply, right? The rules of economics are mostly about these outside Dunbar's number rules. They're about how do we do stuff outside here, not so much how do we do stuff inside here. Which isn't to say economics doesn't have a lot to say about these things, but these basic rules where $20 is better than $20 worth of something, that is true outside of this smaller scenario. All right, so inside of that scenario, right, inside there, inside your group of Dunbar's number, you can do things like, say, go on a camping trip and rely on your friends to chop wood or to go to the camp store and buy some eggs or ice. You can rely on personal relationships to adequately deal with the problems of scarcity you face in that situation when you're dealing with people who are in that small group. But once you start dealing with a larger society, now you need to move to a different set of rules. Now you need to use markets. Except, of course, that markets involve some transaction costs. So sometimes as we ramp up what we're doing, we don't do everything in markets. We don't do everything in markets with personal relationships, and we don't do everything in markets as far as just the raw task of creating valuable goods out of our scarce resources. So let's come back to the nature of the firm and transaction costs. This is our big thing. So let's think about what happens when transaction costs are low. So if I want some new thing, right? So let's say this is my favorite brand of pens, my G2 from Pilot. I got this box from Amazon. It was really easy. Buying stuff on Amazon is a scenario with low transaction costs. You can do it when you're drunk. Buying stuff from Amazon is the easiest thing in the world, pretty much. Now, what about when I bought my house? When I bought my house, the transaction costs were much, much higher. And as a result, it's much more difficult to just very simply say, my marginal benefit is greater than the price. That price is greater than someone's marginal cost. So Pilot sells me pens and we're both happy as a result. Right? When transaction costs are low, it's easy to find those gains from trade. When transaction costs are high, either it's going to be more difficult, and so we're just going to get fewer of those exchanges, right? And we could even just think of that as what's the cost of doing business, right? So just a higher supply curve because higher marginal costs. But when we have low transaction costs, it's easy to outsource, right? So if we think about the world that we live in now with the internet versus the world that we lived in 50 years ago when we had phones and phone books, but not the internet, the nature of the mix of how we organize the economy is going to be moving less in the direction of big firms that organize things from the top down and more in the direction of decentralized things. So things like Fiverr or Uber is a great example. In the case of, say, how do you get around New York City 50 years ago? Well, you just get a cab, right? Or you go back in time 100 years ago before extensive regulation on cabs. You might want to go with the Checker Cab Company because you know they're a big company. You can sue them if they really mess things up. They have brand name capital, right? So with those high transaction costs, including things like, say, low ability to trust, we're going to expect bigger islands of socialism in the sea of markets. As transaction costs come down, it becomes easier for firms to shrink, and rather than make everything in-house, they just buy from some other firm. So the higher transaction costs are, we have an empirical claim we can make. The higher transaction costs are, the bigger we should expect firms to be, and as a result, the less benefits we get from using the market. But as the costs of using markets fall, right, this is a big thing that the internet has provided for us. It's a lot easier to get information. It's a lot easier to evaluate that information. It's a lot easier to find trading partners. And as a result, we have much more small scale entrepreneurship rather than this large scale corporatization. One more thing I wanted to point out to connect this to something we saw in the strength of weak ties. In the strength of weak ties, I'm looking at page 15 of the PDF. As I was reading this, it occurred to me that this is really telling an important story that you see a lot when you read about the history of the internet, especially with Silicon Valley. So they give, well, actually, let's start with the example in the paper. So Boston looks something like this. There's the Charles River goes around. So here's sort of downtown Boston, and then you've got, all this stuff down this direction. I guess it goes like this. Charlestown is somewhere up here. Somerville, where I used to live, is over here, and Cambridge is down here. The West End is this neighborhood in Boston, and there's another famous neighborhood called the North End. The North End is a really wonderful place. If you get a chance to go to Boston, you got to go to the North End. Get a cannoli, go to Mike's Pastries, get Italian food. It's so great. It's an awesome place. The West End was another neighborhood. Both of these neighborhoods were sort of insular neighborhoods filled with immigrants who were setting up their life. And then in the 50s and 60s, the mid-20th century, there was a big movement, there were a variety of movements. Around the New York area, this was Robert Moses undertaking a lot of these things, basically where politically important people would come and eminent domain, big swaths of land, bulldoze it, destroy these communities, and replace it with, modern stuff. In the case of the West End, this was, these awful Soviet-looking cinder block concrete buildings that they thought were exciting. The North End was able to overcome this because they had a particular social structure that enabled them to oppose these efforts. The West End was less successful. So Boston lost one really wonderful neighborhood. It saved the other, and that boiled down to a question of social structure. Now, around the same point in the paper, this really drives home a sort of almost a mythology of another story you hear a lot, which is outside of Boston. There is a place called Route 128. So there are a lot of big tech firms along Route 128. And then on the other end of the country is Silicon Valley. I went to undergrad at San Jose State University in Silicon Valley. I went to grad school in Boston near Route 128. These two areas, these two centers of tech, have two very different types of social structures. In 128, you get a lot of non-compete, non-disclosure agreements, right? I'll just say NDAs, non-disclosure agreements. So if you go work for, I think MATLAB is on 128. Maybe they are. Let's say they are. We'll make up a company, Globocorp, on 128. You go get a job working for Globocorp as a computer programmer. They're going to say, hey, we're going to pay you a bunch of money, but if you ever leave here, you're not allowed to work for any of our competitors for like 3 years, something like that. From Globocorp's perspective, what this means is they are reducing the ability of knowledge to flow out of their organization and give their competitors an advantage. In Silicon Valley, it is totally normal and expected that developers will bounce around between different companies. So maybe you get a job at Adobe, and then you move over to Google, then you move over to Apple. You bounce around, and as you're going, you're drawing knowledge with you. For any individual company, they would probably prefer to look like the Route 128 story. But for the ecosystem as a whole, Silicon Valley has been much more successful. So the cost of not having your employees sign these NDAs is that maybe your employee learns a bunch of stuff at your place and then goes and makes your competitor a bunch of money. But the benefit is that maybe you pick up employees from your competitor and they bring a bunch of knowledge to you and make you more profitable. This is essentially a public good, right? And it's sort of a trust thing too that we'll talk about also in the next module, which is this culture with a lot of mobility is allowing these small world networks to evolve and to grow, as opposed to these much more clustered caveman type networks here, where you've got these hierarchies that are relatively fixed. Information, knowledge, expertise doesn't flow as well here, right? It doesn't flow out, but it also doesn't flow in. And this is why we talk about Silicon Valley a lot more than we talk about Route 128. This is, again, a thing where there's a network structure. 128 involves much higher transaction costs, much larger, fewer big firms, versus Silicon Valley, where you've got a ton of startups and big firms, but you've got a lot more movement of knowledge and you've got a lot more exploitation of that network structure to allow a more productive overall environment. All right, let me give a really quick rundown of transaction costs. The big idea here is when you make a transaction, right? So I buy some pins from Amazon, or I buy parts for my keyboard from Kibio, or I buy pills from Wells Fargo for my back pain. With all of these things, any transaction you make, it's not just the price. It's also the effort to go through and make this transaction work. You've got to have the property rights. You've got to have the right paperwork. Now, for a pen, not a big deal. For a house, it becomes a big deal. Knowledge about quality, knowledge about all the things involved in figuring out, is this a good idea? Or making sure that things are going to work out well. All of those things are transaction costs. There are a lot of things that prevent us from getting the straightforward, mutually beneficial exchange that we talk about with our supply and demand models. When we have those transaction costs, we get two important things. One is it becomes harder to resolve conflicts, becomes harder to negotiate to a mutually beneficial resolution to this local externality, right? Now, in the case of international externalities, the lesson should be, let's go with Pigouvian taxes. Let's tax pollution. But on a small scale, we would like to be able to solve our own problems, and we can get that to the extent transaction costs are low and property rights are clear. When we have high transaction costs, we need to be much more careful about where we assign these property rights, these decision rights. So that is it as it applies to externalities. And then as it applies to understanding the mix of the overall setup of the economy, this mix between top-down organizations versus decentralized markets, the higher transaction costs are, the more we go to using firms and these rigid hierarchical organizations rather than these decentralized high information organizations where we're getting prices, we're getting adaptability, we're getting a lot more entrepreneurship, but there's a trade-off, right? And that trade-off is transaction costs. When transaction costs are high, we're going to have a different outcome. A huge thing the internet has done for us is it has lowered transaction costs. First, it lowered transaction costs on the computer, and now with phones in our pocket that have internet access, it's lowered transaction costs for a lot of other things so that we can have a lot more of these decentralized things that you heard about in the podcast with this module. All right, so that's transaction costs. It's a simple enough idea, but it has profound implications. This is something that I hope you will keep in the back of your head as you continue to study economics. As usual, feel free to ask questions in the usual places, and I will see you in the future.